This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC, Boz Digital Labs, and JZ Microphones. So get ready to rock.
When Def Leppard made that record, sold 8 million copies in the first, 4 or 5 months it was out. And that woke up the record industry to the idea that this form of music could really generate huge amounts of profit and numbers. And so that's what everybody started going after.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. This episode is sponsored by OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Now find out how awesome your studio can be at OWC. This episode is sponsored by Boz Digital Labs, offering you the coolest plugins for your mixes, like the Hoser XT and Plus 10 dB Signature Series. You can transform your drums with Sasquatch Kick Machine or Transgressor, get massive bass with Big Clipper, or add width and depth using Mongoose and Imperial Delay. All Boz Digital Labs plugins are available as fully functioning, no time limit free trials, so you can check them out on your mixes right now. Just go to bozdigitallabs.com or click the link in the show notes of this episode. This episode is sponsored by JZ Microphones with the unique Golden Drop capsule design. The Black Hole Series BH1S and BH2 microphones with the hole in the middle for a one-of-a-kind shock mount combine innovative industrial design with careful craftsmanship to bring a world-class sound to your studio, resulting in a level of quality and detail in your recordings that you won't find in other mics. Go to jzmic.com or click the link in the show notes below and use the limited time coupon ROCKSTAR right now to get an incredible 50% off. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Wyn Davis, joining us from Redondo Beach, California, and I'm actually going to read his bio to you because I think it tells his story really well, and it reads well like that. So this is coming from Wyn's bio. I started out playing guitar when I was 10, grew up in Southern California, and was influenced by the music that was created here and in Northern California, Beachboys, Doors, Canned Heat, Spirit, Jefferson Airplane, Frank Zappa, and all of it. I think the releases of 1967 to 68, the folk music, the rock music, the psychedelic music, the British invasion, all of that was the foundation of my ear. I played in bands, and in 1974 moved to New York and performed throughout the Northeast at over 200 colleges and universities, and in 78 moved back to Los Angeles and was introduced to Ken Scott. Ken was already a legend, having mixed I Am the Walrus, producing the first 3 or 4 David Bowie albums, engineering the Beatles' White Album, etc. Ken and I became friends. We worked extensively together, and he passed on many of the EMI Abbey Road British audio engineer DNA that shaped many of the ways I approached the job as an audio engineer. In 1981, I opened my studio in Redondo Beach, California, and named it Total Access after a backstage pass I'd been given a few weeks earlier by George Massenburg when he was mixing front of house for Earth, Wind & Fire. I imagined I'd be able to record my own music, but quickly found out that keeping a studio open required clients. By word of mouth, the studio gained a reputation as a place where young bands could record in a professionally designed space and come away with competitive results. Our clients started with LA punk band Black Flag, and then a bunch of SST record artists, Husker Du, The Descendants, and others. And the studio flourished in the 1980s hair metal era, doing strings of albums by Dokken, Great White, White Lion, and others. The beach cities were always a source of amazing musical energy, and during the 1990s, Total Access recorded important post-punk artists such as Sublime, No Doubt, Pennywise, Slightly Stupid, and others. After nearly 40 years in the business, Total Access remains a place where prepared young talent can get a break and find affordable rates to record in the same rooms and on the same gear that their heroes recorded on. To keep this studio open in the current market climate, it hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. There is nothing better than playing back a great performance to someone who has never heard themselves recorded properly. I also want to give a shout out to Steve Ornest from Total Access Recording for making our introduction to Wyn Davis. So please welcome Wyn Davis to Recording Studio Rockstars. Wyn, are you ready to rock, man?
I am ready to rock, always.
Dude, I loved reading your bio story. And as I was saying to you, I was at first I was going to kind of take it and reword it in my own. And then I realized it was so great to just hear it in your own words. So I appreciate you letting me just read your own bio out like that.
Well, thanks for reading it. And I appreciate the opportunity to share some of that stuff with you.
Well, it's a really cool story, man. You've been through so much. Tell us a little bit about, in your own words, about that early stage of recording. Were you recording in New York before you moved to LA and started working with Ken Scott?
Yeah, when I moved to New York, I took a 3340 with me and a TIAC 3340 and recorded the band I was working with on a little 4-track the whole time we were gone. And so that was sort of I actually started recording stuff in my dad's garage on an Echoplex and bouncing the tracks out to a reel-to-reel and using the Echoplex as a sort of multi-track recorders because I could let the tape come around, and when it came around to the right spot, I would start the next part. And then when I got to the point where the parts started to generationally get too far away, I would bounce it to a 2-track.
What a trip.
And anyway, so I had a little bit of tinkering around with recording stuff before I went to New York. And then when we went to New York, I just recorded stuff there on a TIAC 3340 and tried to make that work. And
now, is that a 4-track?
Yeah, it's a 4-track. It's a 1/4-inch 4-track, right? Mm-hmm.
The upright reel-to-reel?
Yeah, analog reel-to-reel.
I've seen some of those, I think. Were there many different TIACs that looked similar in those models?
I think there were actually 2 or 3 models of them over the years. They had this little switch on them called Sound on Sound, and which basically meant that you could put some of the tracks into sync and then record on some of the other tracks. It was pretty bare bones, but if you had a decent mic and you had a decent spot where you could record, if you could find a decent space to record in, it came out pretty good. I mean, it's where I learned a lot about the value of a good performance as opposed to relying on a lot of gear.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it's sort of ironic. We'll probably come back and talk about this now, but with the vast capabilities of recording digitally and the giant dynamic ranges and things like that, sometimes we really bend over backwards to try and make the recordings we're doing today sound like those old limited tape machines again, because they had great character to them.
Well, yeah, they had great character. And, I don't know, a lot of times the limitations that people are faced with create, really wonderful results. I mean, limitations are good things. And, it's not necessary for you to have every tool that's ever been created at your fingertips.
Yeah.
It's important to have an idea of what you want to walk away with first, and then figure out which tools you need instead of the other way around.
It can be kind of a burden even because it can
Yeah.
really slow you down. I imagine that long before, laptop computers that have a million choices in them, you might have been faced with studios that had way too many recording channels on a console or a vast mic collection that could be daunting as well.
Well, microphones and channels on a, analog console aren't as intimidating, I think, as technology that you are presented with that you don't understand and that you're not prepared to use.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that as the information age, sort of took over the recording studio business and the business of making music, a lot of people who came from the generation I came from were left behind. A lot of really very, very talented people who, just were either not willing or unprepared or just had already had enough. And, were left behind by that. But a lot of those skill sets were what made those records sound the way they did, not the equipment. The equipment doesn't really make a record. The people who play on it and the people who engineer it do. And
yeah, indeed.
And I think that's a lot of times, instead of, people are chasing, getting the right Neve transformer in their 1073, thinking that will be, the magic, but the magic isn't in that transformer. The magic is in their heads and in their fingers and, in their voices. And as long as we as engineers don't screw it up somehow, that's where it all happens.
Yeah. So I feel like, in my experience, one of the best ways to learn that lesson is to get your hands on that amazing transformer or that incredible tube compressor and plug in a really crappy musician through it and start to discover that your record doesn't sound as good as the record that inspired you to do all this in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's so true. You can't make it. No amount of gear is going to make a bad performance sound good. And the truth is, as long as you're at least somewhat competent and responsible, it's hard to hide a great performance.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that. It's a great quote. It's hard to hide a great performance.
Yeah, I mean, think about the fact that These Dreams, right, by the Eurythmics, that thing was recorded on a 4-track cassette recorder in an apartment.
Wow, I didn't know that.
It was a #1 hit, right? Dave Stewart recorded that, and it was on one of those portable cassette recorders that they originally recorded that track. And and Annie Lennox, you can't deny her, no matter what you record her on.
That's great. That's great. What a cool story, man. Thanks for sharing that. Well, let's see. You moved out to Los Angeles in 1978 and worked with Ken Scott. Talk about that process. I mean, he's a legendary, was a legendary engineer and producer, I think, and has done so much great stuff. Just tell us the story of that, if you don't mind.
In the band that I was in before I moved to New York, was sort of a hippie folk band that had a flute player in it, and
nice.
And he and I were really, really close friends, but we parted ways when I moved to New York, and I didn't see him for like 4 years. And then when I moved back to LA, I looked him up, I gave him a call, and he was working as Ken's personal assistant. And the first thing he did was said, "Oh, you got to come over and meet this guy." I didn't know who Ken was at the time. I mean, I just was unfamiliar with the music that he was working on and who he was, because that wasn't what I was doing at the time. But he and I became friends pretty quickly. And when when I opened the studio, he was working at a different place out in the valley, and I tried for a couple of years to get him to come out, and he's very much a creature of habit, and so he didn't want to change rooms, he didn't want to upend his life. Plus, I live in Redondo Beach, and he was living in the San Fernando Valley, and even in those days, it was that's a trek.
Yeah. Now in LA, if you're 5 miles apart, you might as well send a postcard.
Yeah. Which is one of the things I'll tell you. That's one of the things I'm so grateful for. But that's another story. I have clients that spent months driving from the valley, driving by 50 studios to get here, which I could never fully understand, but I was so grateful for. But
that's wild. That's great.
Yeah. Anyway, Ken was one of those. And after that studio closed, the first thing he did is call me up. He said, I need a new place to work. And he came over and he played some stuff on the main monitors, which is what he likes to use. And he said, yeah, I can work here. And, he worked here for like almost 20 years.
Wow. So when you moved from New York out to LA, you were pretty quick to open up your studio. What was that all about? I mean, did you already have sort of a real vision for what you wanted to do with your studio, or was this like, hey, I think I'm going to try opening a studio? What was that point for you like?
Well, here's that story, and I'll try and make it as short as possible. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Blow. It is a Johnny Depp movie where
yeah.
Right. So that all takes place in Hermosa, Manhattan, Redondo Beach. That whole, that's where the movie opens up. And this was the epicenter of the introduction of, sort of on a commercial level of, the cocaine trade and all that stuff that happened. And the studio here was the result of some guys who were in that business and talked to a few real estate developers into getting into it. And they started to build it. It went about, they got it about halfway built and leased a bunch of equipment. And then, as will happen when you have a bunch of drugs involved in something, they found themselves basically out of business and in debt. And the studio went into receivership, and I heard about it. And I had been working at another studio, as an artist and assistant in Hermosa Beach called Media Art. And when I heard about this place coming up, and I thought, man, maybe I should go down and find out what's going on with that place. And
wow.
I showed up at a hearing at a courthouse where they were going to dispense with all the assets, and basically told the judge that I would take them all over.
Wow.
And they allowed me to do that. And I came in here and just started trying to make it work. And it was way more than I bargained for. I thought it was just going to be someplace where I could take over and make a record with the band I was in, and then then we'd all be rock stars and we wouldn't have to worry about it.
Well, we're all rock stars now on this podcast, right? So it's a good thing, finally. Well, what a story. And so when you heard about this, I'm sure that felt like a little bit of a big risky move for you, like a bold move. And you moved in, you were able to get this place that was kind of half finished, where you had the big part of the structure of constructing a studio started for you, and you just needed to finish it out.
Right, exactly. And it wasn't fully, it had all the right gear to start off with, for the time. Had an MCI 528 console in it, and a MM1200, and a couple of 1176s, and a few nice mics. And the guy had somehow met or been introduced to Dean Jensen, and they had retrofitted the MCI 528 with Jensen transformers and mic
Oh,
reads.
cool.
And so that console actually sounded pretty darn good. And still to this day, sometimes I'll put on one of those old tapes and I'll think, wow, man, that console really sounded great. But
well, that's cool. I also have an MCI here. I have one that Jeep built custom for Criteria Studios.
Oh yeah.
So it was a Criteria through the 1970s. So it's before the 400 and 500 series.
Oh wow. Yeah, those were good. Those guys did nice work in those days. I mean, those were nice consoles. So they're hard. They were hard at the end of the lifespan of that console for us. The thing that basically drove that console out of the studio for us was that all the switches and pots and stuff just became unmanageable.
Yeah. Well, that's sadly because the name MCI, some people joke, stands for most connections intermittent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Well,
cool.
That's and the funny part of this is sort of a complete aside, but in those days, Brent Averill, who went on to become, have a whole, his business started as he had this business where you would pull your modules out, and he had this sonic bath, this sonic bath that you would put your modules in, and he would run this solution, through it, and it would clean all the pots. And when you put them back in, it actually worked really well for, maybe, 3 or 4 months. And then they would just go back to as bad as they ever were. But, but it was really, it was like getting a new console for a short time. And it was funny. I remember Brent doing that. It was fascinating that he.
That's wild. Well, it's interesting to hear the stories of all the various businesses that can spring up around the recording industry just based on need at that time.
Oh, yeah.
This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can go to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level. And you can start right now with my free introduction to mixing course, Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is that these mixing techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you are in Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or anything you can think of. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, or look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. So you started the studio. Ken came back later and listened. Were you pretty confident that when he came in and listened to your control room, he was going to love it? Or were you just like fingers crossed? I mean,
yeah,
what for you,
crossed.
What for you was part of the process of making sure that your control room sounded great?
Well, I had a guy here who had worked at Wally Heider during the height of Wally Heider's studio. His name is, unfortunately, I don't know if this was some kind of practical joke by his parents or whatever, but his name's Peter Butt. And Peter is somebody who any of the older folks who listen to this podcast know about, because he managed Wally Heider when they had like 52 MM1200s running. And one of the legacies of Peter's tenure there was that they went for almost 2 years without a single card failure in one of those machines. He is a brilliant service tech and a very, very bright guy. And I got him because he lived in San Pedro, which is sort of adjacent to where I live. I got him to be our tech, and he tuned our Uri, what were they? They were 813s. Yeah, the Uri 813s. He tuned our Uri 813s in a way that just made them sound absolutely fantastic. And we loved those speakers, and I loved them, and I could listen to them all day. And it turned out that when Ken came in, he had never worked on them before, but he liked them too. And for whatever reason, the nodes, the sonic nodes in this room and those speakers all sort of lined up and agreed, and they always sounded great in here. I was really sad when Altec stopped being able to basically rehabilitate those drivers so that they sounded right anymore, because there was a time when they just stopped working.
Now, do you remember the sort of introduction of the near field monitors in studios? Because I mean, for a time, the big speakers in the walls, that was what everybody listened to, right?
Yeah, the big speakers in the soffits, which I still have, but well, near fields were something that I embraced, completely, because unlike a lot of the people who worked here in those days, I didn't like to listen at super high sound pressure levels. There was just something about it that just overwhelmed me, and as an engineer and a mixer, so. The near fields were something that I worked on. I worked on a whole bunch. I mean, I went to every sort of hi-fi. I went through a lot of speakers. I went through a lot of speakers trying to find something that I could relate to and that sounded good and gave me good results. And then one day I walked into a session that Roger Nichols, and he was using Meyer HD1s, and I went, oh wow, I'm going to get some of those, and it was a transformative moment, putting John Mayer's speakers on the console, and immediately going through this transformation with all of my clients, where up until then, every time I would bring somebody in to listen to a mix, there was all this like nitpicking through stuff. All right, why don't you solo the hi-hat, and can I hear the guitar? It just, all that stopped. I mean, literally in a day. And
interesting.
People just started saying stuff like, "Could you just turn the vocal up a little bit?" And then they would go, "That's perfect." And all the nitpicking that went on in my work with my clients just immediately stopped, which I think says something about having the right presentation environment for your mixes. That's an important, super important component of having a successful relationship with your producer, the artists you work with, having something that when you play it back for them that is relatable and actually expresses your vision of their music properly and accurately.
It looks like you guys still have the HD1s. I'm looking at the website now, and that's what's up on the console.
I never stopped using them. And most of the people who come in here who listen to them, even if they have been working on other stuff, they'll leave them up and they'll use them. I recently had the good fortune to install John Mayer's big soffit-mounted speaker in our soffit, which is called an X10 system, which is comprised of a couple of 15-inch drivers and 4 18-inch subwoofers, and that system sounds incredible at high sound pressure levels. I don't listen to them that way, but but it's a great system if somebody wants to come in and blow their hair back. Yeah.
Talk about the progression of mixing consoles and tape machines and stuff like that at your studio.
We started out with MM1100s, and that man that I was talking to you about earlier, Peter, was a renowned and world-famous expert on those machines. Those machines had a lot of problems. They had motor drive amplifiers that were very idiosyncratic, let's say. The MM1200 had speed issues from head to tail and stuff. And Peter was a genius at solving those problems with that machine, even though it required some fairly continuous work and adjustment and attention. It was the best machine by, some people like Studers, some people like Ampex. We always liked Ampex around here. And then when when we got rid of those machines, I sort of went and sided with, no pun intended, but I sided with Alan Sides, and we bought ATR 124s.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, we love those machines.
Well, it's interesting, hearing you talking about keeping a machine tuned and running. I think we forget, today, the things that you have to keep tuned and running, like all that's left is the piano and the guitars, and maybe the drums.
Yeah, well,
but back then it was the recording gear too.
Oh yeah, that was. I keep trying to explain to the young people that work with me that, man, you guys have got it so easy. You don't realize that on all these sessions where you're showing up an hour early to pull mics and stands and cables and everything, add another hour and a half to that when you're going to have to align, bias, print a set of tones for a new project, and then check that every single day when you come in.
Yeah.
It was just a whole nother layer of time and effort and attention that not everybody did. But if you wanted to do it professionally, and, that's what happened when Ken got here, all of that stuff became required. I mean, we couldn't start a session without going through all of that stuff, and he expected it, and he wouldn't have it any other way. And he really taught us a lot about the discipline of looking after all of those details because they matter, and they did matter, and they still matter, but
yeah,
in different ways.
Well, I remember when I'm using my tape machine, which I haven't been using in a while, but the process of tuning it and aligning it and everything, you didn't have to do it. You could just turn it on and go and see what happened. But every time you did it and you did it well, your session just sounded better in the end. Everything sounded better,
That's right. And that's why you do it. And the other reason to do it was that it was a professional responsibility to your client, because if they needed to go someplace else and they took those tapes with them, you wanted, wherever they went, and wherever you went with them, or wherever those tapes followed them, you wanted the work that you did to be able to be represented properly. And without an alignment, a set of tones, good documentation on the reel boxes and all that stuff, you couldn't, you didn't have any way, they wouldn't have any way of replicating the work they did.
Yeah.
So it was super important.
And I find that today the modern version of that are things like, backing up your digital sessions properly, labeling things properly from Pro Tools sessions to Pro Tools sessions, all that kind of stuff.
There is no standard now. I mean, the technical wing of the Grammy guys have tried to put together some stuff, but with so many people who work, and we work now with so many people who do stuff on their own and don't have the privilege and the joy of being taught anything by and existing in any kind of framework of a professional legacy of how do we do this so that everybody can participate. And so you'll get sessions and stuff that just are so confused and so difficult. It's a ball of yarn, and that's part of our job now, right? Is unwinding those balls of yarn. From,
yeah, right on.
It's in some, I think somebody just posted on Facebook the other day. Right after the Grammys, that he thought that he's somebody that you've interviewed. Gosh, I can't. Anyway, he said that there should be a Grammy for all the seconds and people who are doing the soul-crushing work of tuning vocals and realigning drums. And
yeah, big time.
Because these people are, toiling away in the salt mines of these studios, bringing stuff, trying to make people, who don't really, who didn't bring it in the studio with them, sound like they did.
And also I would suggest that most of the records that have won Grammys in the past, 5 to 10 years have probably had a lot of, backroom work done on them as part of just this, this big production process.
There's absolutely no question about that, man.
Well, so your studio has had such a wonderful history of things. Oh, I guess you were just talking about the consoles. What came after, the early MCI? I think you have something different in the photos now.
Yeah, there's we bought an AMEC. It was a weird choice. We were, Ken really wanted an SSL, and I never really cared for the sound of an SSL. It sounded, to me, to my ear, it was not something that I related to. I was definitely more on the Neve side of things than I would have been in that sort of solid state side of things. And so we decided to buy an AMEC.
Which one did you get?
It's called the G2520, and it was the one that was they only built probably half a dozen of them. There were a couple of them down in Nashville for a while, and there were a couple of them over in Asia. And I think the most notable version is that they recorded Joshua Tree, a lot of Joshua Tree on a 2520.
Oh, interesting.
That they installed at the Edge's studio.
And when was this that you guys would have put that in? Is that the same console that survives today?
Yeah, that would have been in 85. Yeah.
Wow, what a trip. So that's pretty wild. So what does it mean to try and maintain a piece of gear from 1985 to 2019? Is it a challenge at times?
It's a constant challenge. I mean, once these consoles get to this age, it's a constant challenge to keep them running and operating the way that they were designed to. Mm-hmm. And it's still worth it, but it's a challenge. I mean, this console has already had every capacitor in it changed twice.
Wow.
So, and that's a huge undertaking. I mean, it's hard to describe really. If you've never had to do it, then
it's a lot. You got to pull out each card probably has lots and lots of capacitors on it.
Yeah.
You have to take over the studio for weeks, or do you just do one at a time over time?
No, I think that we tried that once, and it was sort of frustrating because you'd be going down the line, and all of a sudden you'd go, "Hey, man, this console doesn't have as much. This channel doesn't have as much bottom," and then you realize, oh, we didn't do that one yet. So
yeah,
it became so at that point, we just started doing them. We would just block out some time and pull all the modules and snip out buckets full of capacitors and replace them, and then go through the recommissioning of each module. As and of course you'd find one or two cold solder joints every 2 or 3 modules and have to pull it out. It's a process. I mean, studios are things that you have to have a love for it if you want to have one. Way easier to just plug in your Pro Tools gear into your computer and use some little moving fader Yukon interface and forget about it. But I can tell you without any question in my mind whatsoever that working in a hybrid recording environment where you have the best of both worlds is one of the greatest things that has ever happened to music. I mean,
that's cool.
I listened to the 5-1 mixes the other day of Abbey Road. I mean of Sgt. Pepper's, and it was life-changing. I mean, those guys, that's something you could have never done until now. There's no way those guys could have gone back and reassembled, all those original performance tapes and taken all the bits and pieces that they were able to find in the archives, reassemble them, realign them so that performances that up until now had only been heard, after like maybe 4 or 5 generational,
copies. Yeah.
Right. Now we're hearing some of those performances off the original tapes that were able to be.
Interesting.
I think that work that those guys did, some people are purists and I understand it, but gosh, for me, it was just so awesome to hear
that's cool
stuff in that way. And anybody who hasn't heard it, go out and find a really good spot, find somebody who's got a great 5.1 system and buy it and listen to it because it's so much fun.
That's wild. Well, let's rewind a little bit and let's we'll get away from the tech geekery stuff that we love so much. And let's talk about the music. Here you are in Redondo Beach, California. It's post the cocaine rush of stuff in the 70s. And now we're into the 80s and you've connected with SST Records, the great influence in punk rock coming from the West Coast. Talk about some of the bands that you worked with at that point. And I'm thinking that did that happen first and then was followed by the 80s hair metal bands, or were they all happening at the same time?
Well, sort of at the same time. They sort of overlapped, but yeah, SST started first. Greg Ginn, is a pioneer and all that stuff, and a founder of Black Flag and the founder of SST. And, he's a remarkable person, really. And he needed, we had this recording studio space and he needed a place where he could, and this is more of sort of a business relationship. He needed a place where he could make these records and know what the financial commitment was going to be in advance without having to go say, okay, how much is this record going to cost me? And watching it, spiral out of his financial control. Mm-hmm. So we made him a deal where we would sell him a fixed amount of time at a fixed rate that he could afford. And then he would just tell his bands, this is how much time you've got. And if you don't make a record, you don't have one. And that's it.
That's great.
Yeah. and so he would, I mean, Husker Du came out here and recorded Metal Circus. And they literally drove all the way from Minneapolis to Redondo Beach in one go. And they pulled up into the parking space and the van belched out a giant, puff of smoke. And I think they actually had to have it worked on before they could drive back. And they came in and they started working with a guy that had been working with me at Media Arts. And his name is Glenn. I can't remember his last name, but everybody knew him as Spot. And he came in and started working that session. And we set up the band. And I think Greg came in and said, you have 2 days to make this record, so hurry up. And the band came in, and the first night they were here, I left them and they were playing and they were doing takes. And the next morning when I came in, they were all where I left them, except for they were all asleep, literally with their instruments in their hand. And when I came in, I walked into the control room and I said, hey, Spot, what's going on? Spot hit the talk back and said, okay, you guys. And they all just sort of stood up like, marionettes. And he said, let's go. And he hit record and they started playing. Like, it was incredible.
What a story, man. That's great.
Yeah. And, they were driven and they finished the record and it's an amazing piece of work. I mean, if you listen to that record today and you realize that, how young those guys were. What an amazing creative statement it is, and the fact that they just did it all literally in 48 hours uh, without leaving the studio. I mean, I don't know. I don't even know if they ate while they were here. I mean, it's
wow.
Yeah.
That's great, man. I love hearing stories like that. I know. Do you remember whether the Meat Puppets came out and recorded with you there
They
too?
did, yes. They recorded here too. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we heard some of that story before on the podcast as well. So it's cool stuff. I mean, I was in college in the Midwest in St. Louis in the 80s, second half of the 80s. So we were, discovering these SST records as they would show up through friends and record stores and on the local college station. And here you were making them all.
Yeah, I don't know. Did you ever hear that band that SST did called Saint Vitus?
No.
They were like, oh yeah, they were the punk version of Black Sabbath. I mean, they were a bunch of kids from San Pedro who came from sort of the they were all first generation Mexican kids, and they were playing this really great version, these really great versions of these really dark progressions. And instead of being this frenetic, crazy punk stuff, it was really slow, dirgy stuff that was way ahead of its time.
Nice.
So interesting. I've always wondered why those records never reappeared in any sort of critical way, because they were so interesting and unique at the time. And
that's wild. Well, now, how about, do you have any stories about the Descendants or any of the other bands from SST?
Well, the only thing, the Black Flag, I got a call from the Redondo Beach Police Department one day when I was, about 2:30 in the morning, and the guys were standing on top of the roof shouting at, howling at the moon, and all the neighbors in the neighborhood. They were everything that that you would expect. I mean, they had this tremendous energy and commitment to what they were doing, and I feel really fortunate. I have to say, to be completely honest, that I didn't completely understand how important those records were going to be, when we were making them. I was grateful to Greg for, allowing us to have enough business from SST and enough revenue to keep the studio's doors open. But I didn't really understand how important and fun those records were going to be later. Yeah. And I'm so grateful that all that stuff happened here. And looking back on it, it's a wonderful memory. I mean, it's a great part of the studio's history. That whole scene for us sort of got displaced when the Sunset Strip hair metal scene started to take off, and the major labels started signing bands and giving them stupid amounts of money to make, records that were, I don't know how to say this in any polite way, but, pretty forgettable records. I mean, obviously for some people who were alive then, they were really important, but I don't think they made the same sort of critical, creative statements that a lot of those earlier punk records made. And anyway, they were, but they did allow the studio a different sort of. They gave us a profile with the major players and the labels in Los Angeles that allowed us to stay open.
Well, so I would propose that the 80s hair metal era did sort of create a sonic statement. It sort of created a sound that will forever be there. And I want to get into that more and deeper, talk about those specifically with you in a minute when we come back from the break. But before we do, was the early Red Hot Chili Peppers, was that also part of the sound and the bands that were coming in to work with you guys at that point? Or were they elsewhere?
No, we never saw those guys in this room, but
Okay.
but they were. I think that they were certainly part of that whole scene.
Yeah, that's
There
sort of how I
was,
remember it.
yeah, the beach cities had uh, their own punk scene, and it was important. And then there was the Hollywood punk scene that had X and Fear and a whole bunch of other bands like that. And they did sort of overlap. We did a record. I think Michael Wagner actually recorded. Michael's lives out there in Nashville now.
Yeah.
And he worked here for a long time. He started here when he first came to the United States.
Oh,
He
cool.
worked here for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. He did a lot of records here. And one of them that he did was a demo for X when he was actually auditioning to do that record that he ended up producing for them. And it was the record that their cover of that song Wild Thing. You remember that?
I don't know if I remember that one specifically, but
Well, it appeared in this movie, about this baseball movie that had I think it had Kevin Costner in it or something like that.
Oh, right. Build it and they will come.
Yeah. Oh, no, not that baseball movie. It was another one where I think it was about a pitcher and he was the catcher, and
was that the
and they called it Wild Thing, and they played the song all the way through the movie. I bet you X made as much money from that song appearing in that movie as they did in their whole career.
That's a trip. Yeah. So what's interesting to me too is to hear the stories and realize just how vast Los Angeles is, that you literally can have a variety of different scenes within the same genre happening in different parts of the city. Nashville, on the other hand, is like Nashville is Nashville. And if it's happening in Nashville, it's happening in whichever neighborhood you're in.
Yeah, well, Nashville is an amazing place. I mean, it has been. I mean, I grew up as a kid riding a Greyhound bus between Texas and in Los Angeles with my mother, and every diner that we would stop in, there was country music playing in it, and that I have a lot of that in my DNA too, and I still love it. Mostly the classic stuff, but I mean, the studio I was working in before I opened the studio, I used to see Vince Gill running around all the time before he moved down there, and he was an infuriating person because by that time I'd already been playing guitar for like 15 years, and I forget, but I remember he picked up a guitar one day and just decided he was going to start playing, and it was already like 2 years later, he was better than everybody in the whole.
That's true, man.
He's such an amazingly talented person.
That's cool. Well, hey, we'll take a break here for just a second and come back in for the jam session. Rockstars, a reminder that we'll have links to stuff we're talking about, including a YouTube playlist where you can go listen to some of these records. And we'll try and add some more of them after the interview too. Just make sure that they're all in there. And if you're listening on your mobile device, just click through in the show notes. You should find it there. If you're on your desktop, just go to rsrockstars.com and look for the Wyn Davis episode, WYN, and you can see all the stuff we're talking about there. We'll see you in just a minute for the jam session. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your existing Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD drive, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio far into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. If you want to design and build a great house, then you're going to need great tools. You could build it with an old hammer and some nails, but it's a whole lot easier to use an air compressor and a nail gun. Well, the same thing goes for mixing. If you really want to create a pro-sounding mix, then it makes a lot of sense to start with a great toolbox of awesome plugins. This is where Boz Digital Labs comes in to help you get killer mixes easily, quickly, and creatively. Provocative will make your vocals sound lush and wide. Transgressor and Manic Compressor can help your drums leap out of the speakers. Weighty and Big Beautiful Door offer unique new ways to tighten up your tracks, while the Wall will make sure your mixes are in your face and competitive. And my favorite is Sasquatch Kick Machine, which can transform your kick drum from sounding like a home studio cardboard box into the perfect punchy kick without using samples or triggers. To download your unlimited trial of any plugin now or get one of Boz's free plugins, go to bozdigitallabs.com and put the best in your mixing toolbox. Click the link below in the show notes to learn more. If you want to capture every nuance of a great performance in your studio, then you need to start with a microphone that is crafted with great care and attention to detail. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia designs amazing sounding microphones that are handcrafted with jeweler's precision to bring you incredible detail in your recordings. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design, which uses a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity while avoiding distracting colorations and distortions. Make sure to check out the Black Hole series BH1S and BH2 with the awesome looking hole in the middle of the mic, combining innovative industrial design with meticulous electrical engineering to help your studio sound incredibly expensive for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, if you use the coupon ROCKSTAR, you will get an astonishing 50% off. I got one. You're hearing my voice right now on the BH1S. So what are you waiting for, rock stars? Go to jzmic.com or click the link in the show notes below. Hey, rock stars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Wyn Davis, joining us from Redondo Beach, California, in his studio, Total Access Recording Studio. And we're going to jump in and talk more about all kinds of good stuff, but we're really going to dig into the 80s hair metal scene and then the post-punk scene as well in California. When are you ready to jam?
Yeah.
All right. Again, it's just so amazing that you can kind of share stories about Ken Scott and who he is. And you were telling me some of the amazing Beatles records he worked on. I wondered if you wanted to just kind of introduce us to him a little bit more. And what were some of these records that he worked on?
Oh, I mean, the list of stuff that Ken worked on is, astounding, actually. I mean, he spent the day here one day making a demo CD for himself, which was, sort of heartbreaking, thinking that somebody with his credentials would need a demo CD. But it started off with I Am the Walrus, which he mixed at EMI. Wow. And that was the first thing on the CD, and it just went through just a litany of important rock acts, including Bowie. But the thing that that most people know Ken for is that he engineered and was an important part of putting together the Beatles' White Album, which is a really interesting sounding record, and it was it's really a testament to Ken's skill set, because I think, by all accounts, the Beatles at that point were working at the most furious pace that they possibly could. It wasn't, they just had, I mean, they were in a creative space where they didn't want to wait for anything. They didn't want to wait for any mics to get set up. They just wanted to go, get it, you know, and when you listen to that record, if you the next time you listen to anything off that record, keep that in mind, because they were really they were moving at an amazing pace.
So Ken had to run around a lot, in other words.
Yeah, right. And there was no let me check that mic. You know, it was like, you know, you set up the mic and it was like, okay, what's taking so long? Let's go. Punch in. Don't worry about where the levels are set or how the compressor is set or whatever. You know, just let's get going. Hurry up.
That's wild. Well, I have to confess, I'm sort of guilty of liking to work that way too. When I'm playing music, I'm just the worst. Usually, a lot of times I have an intern helping me engineer, and I just give them hell. I give them a hug and apologize afterwards, but I give them hell while they're recording me.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a hard seat to be in, because, you know, there's no way for somebody to know in advance. I wish there was just some magical, you know, this is the setting that won't screw anything up, but, you know, those settings are hard to come by, you know, most of the time.
Well, in recording in something like Pro Tools these days or digital, it's like there's so much wiggle room. You know, it's like if your level's not right, who cares, as long as you didn't completely distort it. You can always adjust it a little bit later. Things, the tools like clip gain and stuff. Can you imagine, like, I mean, you don't have to imagine. You probably did try and invent clip gain on a piece of analog tape back in the day, and it probably wasn't easy.
No, it wasn't easy. And yeah, there are some pretty amazing ways now of forgiving some what used to be pretty much unforgivable sins. I mean, for instance, if you're recording in 32-bit, you can recover stuff that was recorded at too high a level. There me, I need to.
Oh, it's all right. I dropped a marker, so no worries.
Yeah, you can. There are a lot of unforgivable sins that you can that used to be, you know, basically grounds for getting fired.
Sure,
that you can get away with in Pro Tools and these other digital platforms. I guess it's a good thing. I'm not really sure. I think that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, what were some things that you remember learning from Ken at that point? You know, as he told stories of working with the Beatles and stuff, do you remember picking up on any kind of cool recording techniques or just stuff that you'd never realized before?
Well, every day that Ken was here and working with the people that he worked with was sort of a revelation. I mean, because by the time I met Ken and we started working in the studio together, he'd already had 20 years of nonstop, you know, production engineering experience. He came up through the EMI Abbey Road, you know, engineering school. And, you know, he had been doing that ever since he was 17 years old. So it was, there was never, I don't think was ever a time when he was in the studio with us that we didn't learn something. One of the things that I learned very early on was how great a kick drum can sound with nothing in it at all, and with both heads on.
What do you mean by nothing? Oh, just empty, like no pillow in the middle.
Totally empty kick drum. And what Ken did, I think one of the first things he did when he came in here is he unsoldered a mic cable, put both heads on. I mean, unsoldered a mic cable, fed it through one of the air holes, soldered it back on to the connector, and then suspended an RE20 in the middle of this 26-inch bass drum with nothing in it. And it just sounded gigantic and amazing.
That's great. Great.
Yeah, it had some ring to it, but once everything else was in the track, it just occupied this very, very sort of unique sonic space. And when you listen to all those records, I mean, Ken Ken did a bunch of Billy Cobham records, and he did Birds of Fire by Bob Mahavishnu, and there's there's so much that he got to learn and experience during his times.
Now, were those records that he was doing there as well, or those are records he had done?
No, those are records that he did before I met him, when he was still in England. Cool. He moved to the United States in, I think, 1972 or 3, and to finish the first Supertramp record, which was Crime of the Century. Right?
Well, let's talk about some of the bands that you worked in the hair metal scene of the 1980s. I know you worked with Dokken, Great White, White Lion, all bands that were coming there. And it's funny you talk about kick drums, because that was actually one of the questions I threw in, just talking about the metal scene and, the introduction of this pointy kick drum that just cuts right through a mix. And I wondered if if you got any more thoughts about that, that's fine. But otherwise, just tell us the story of the metal scene there and what it meant for recording in the studio.
Well, I mean, it was, I think that it's hard to quantify what it meant, because it became, there was a race basically to figure out how to make this stuff sound bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the same time, maintain some sort of separation and stuff. I think that, Mike Wagner became one of the architects of that stuff, and his records, I think, spelled out a lot of, and led sort of the vanguard of how to do that. And I think Michael, I'm not sure. I think Michael is the first person that I ever met who introduced it. He introduced it to me when, in the very early 1980s, when we were still working on an MCI console. He had this idea that it might be interesting to bus all of the drums and bass to another compressor and bring it up on 2 faders in parallel with the mix that we had going.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Rock stars, you know what we're talking about here. You know what he's hinting at.
And and I remember listening to it and going, wow, yeah, that makes a big difference. And so I think that, Michael was the very first person I ever saw do a parallel compression on a analog console.
That's wild. What a cool story.
And so, I mean, and Michael is very inventive, and one of those guys who was always chasing a way to make it sound bigger and more aggressive. And in those days, that's what mattered. That's the, and he was great at getting the work done on time, on budget, and he made a lot of those records, a lot of the important records of that time. And he worked here for a while, and he was the reason he worked here was because Dokken, he worked with Dokken over in Germany, and Don Dokken was responsible for actually bringing him over here and getting him set up. And at the time, Don Dokken was working almost exclusively here at this studio. And
well, a couple of the records that I found, just kind of following your discography to YouTube and putting those in the playlist, Great White Hooked, and then Great White Shot in the Dark, and such a difference in sound too. Great White Hooked sounds more like sort of a pure rock band recording. And then Great White Shot in the Dark is this massive, pointy kick drum, exploding reverb snare, and really, wall of guitars. And so it was going to lead me to the question about the progression of sound. And you've already answered it. You just said it was an arms race of production styles trying to make a bigger and badder record along the way. And we're only, what's the time frame of that progression of hair metal production styles? I mean, we're talking about like 7 years, 6 years, 5 years, or more than that.
You're talking about, the first really big Mutt Lange production. I mean, it really started when Def Leppard made that record, and the song Photograph hit.
Pyromania.
Pyromania. That record sold 8 million copies in the first 4 or 5 months it was out, and that woke up the record industry to the idea that this form of music could really generate huge amounts of profit and numbers. And so that's what everybody started going after.
Now, fast forward just a few years, and 1991, and Nirvana Nevermind comes out. And, I remember hearing that sold 20 million copies. And I don't know whether that was more or less than, previous record sales, but I remember, having the impression that was like, it was a new remarkable number of copies of records to be sold. And same thing happened. All of a sudden, the record labels through the 90s were just pouring money at independent music and stuff like that. And, and then that ushers in a new era for you guys too, right?
Yeah, sort of ushered in a new era, but it's also really it's funny. These guys want to start pouring money into independent artists, which actually completely erases their independence.
Right.
I mean, it's a weird thing because, once you start pouring money into these bands, it stops them from being actually what they were. And so it was a strange time. The bands that No Doubt and Sublime were in those days truly still little independent bands that were on very small labels that they had limited resources, and when they were in the studio recording, they didn't have they didn't have this giant corporate machine behind them. They had, themselves and their own creative energy and their own creative vision. And I think that's what made those records really special. It was sort of a return all the way back to the beginning for us when we were working with SST and, these young bands that had, very little, but they had a passion and an energy and made really important records. And it turned out that was true. Those records are still the records that those bands made and started and here and are still super important to a lot of people of that generation. I can't tell you how many young people walk through here and see, the records on our wall from, the Sublime self-titled record, and they're just awestruck.
Yeah, that's so cool, man.
Yeah.
And I mean, a band like No Doubt, I think of those as records where the band was just trying really hard to perform great as a band to get that kind of sound. And even listening to some of the progression of the metal records, like the two Great White records I mentioned, and I'm not sure exactly about the timing, but I think it was like early 80s, late 80s. And the first one, the early one sounds like the band performing together. The last one sounds like it's produced a little bit more one thing at a time, and, everything's dialed in just right. And of course it does have a huge sound, but then, that whole system breaks down to the basics again. And then the next post-punk generation is just bands just trying to perform together. And then eventually that becomes something where everything's trying to be done one piece at a time. And that's, enter Lidge. The late 90s is when I entered the record-making scene and was going through that experience for the first time of trying to figure out how to build a record one brick at a time.
Yeah, well, that's that is one that's one technique, but it's interesting. I'll say this, that just recently I've been working on some stuff with a band from Iceland and a band from Sweden, and both the bands are rock bands. They're, sort of guitar based. I mean, they're ignoring all the current trends of music, but they're recording this stuff as bands. And a lot of what I do nowadays is mixing. So I wish I was doing more of the production and recording side, but it's just hard to get people all in one room anymore. But these bands, that energy can't be replaced. Having people in a room together, making these records and playing as a unit. It's something that you can't replicate any other way. I mean, doesn't mean you can't make a good record, but it's not the same as having people camped out into a studio for, 3 or 4 weeks, chasing down great takes and making changes and listening to each other in real time and making adjustments and coming into the control room and going, you know what, I'm going to do that a little different this time. It's a whole different sort of ball game.
Yeah.
I miss that so much because it's such an important and wonderful part of making records.
Well, it's one of my favorite things to do. And I really took a good close look at what I loved about whatever I do recently. The answer to my question was I love spending a day in the studio making music with friends.
Yeah.
And, I like having a group of people playing together. It's easy for us to start screwing with that. We start isolating ourselves into different rooms and we sort of rip apart the fabric of what it means to play together. But as long as you can keep that together and keep people feeling connected and, I can see your hand strumming the guitar and you can see mine, there's an opportunity to get that energy of the whole band playing together. That just makes it a lot of fun.
Oh yeah. And the records that we started talking about, those kids are not virtuosos. They have a spirit and an energy in their playing, but you can't put a piece of complicated music in front of them printed on a lead sheet and say, okay, play this right now, because that's not who they are. But you put them all in a room together and they make a noise that nobody else is going to make, and that's what people connect to. People connect to that energy and to that honesty and to that that furiousness of creativity and it's and I strongly believe there's no way to replicate that in any other way. And the sad thing about the way the music business is today is that there is not enough incentive left for people to take enough time to spend in the studio, because the only place where there's any money left is in live performance. And so people have to stay on the road. They play all the time. The guys are away from their families longer. And even when they want to, it's hard to justify, all right, let's take 6 weeks off and make a record. It's difficult.
Yeah.
It's difficult to make that happen with the kind of schedules and responsibilities, because there's not enough back end money in the recording part of it to make it make sense anymore.
Well, let me ask you this question about the production process and about a band performing together in a space versus ripping that apart and saying, oh, let's just build it one thing at a time and get it perfect. What are some of the things that you've seen that tend to cause a band to start progressing towards, let's just get this one part perfect and then get this one part perfect, and you begin to lose that performance aspect? Are there common themes that tend to always sort of pull productions in that direction?
Well, it depends on where the creative center of gravity is in the production in the band. I think that's usually where that starts. And there are two different ways that can happen. One of them is that somebody has an expectation of something they want to hear, and they really can't hear it any other way. There's no other way for them to relate to it. And so they just want to hear it this one way. And sometimes the only way to get it there is to tear it apart and just, do it a little bit at a time because for whatever reason, they didn't do it before they got here.
Mm-hmm.
And the other reason is that you have somebody who's not part of the writing or creative process who thinks that by tearing it apart, you're going to make it somehow a lot better. And that I think a lot of times falls on us, the people who rightfully so, people come into the studio, they want to work with a professional engineer, and they assume that we know what we're talking about. So if we tell them, hey, all right, everybody, just, play down one guide track, and then we're going to do the drums, then we're going to do the guitar, then we're going to do the bass. They believe us.
Mm-hmm.
And so you got to be careful what kind of advice you give to young artists and to the people you're working with. And, remember that it's not all about it being perfect. It's all about, how it feels, what makes sense for the song, what makes sense for what the artist is trying to communicate. That's the thing that's most important.
So are we sometimes right as a producer to suggest that we should break it down and really focus on one thing at a time and get it right? Or is that more often than not wrong? What do you have to say about that?
Right and wrong is, completely subjective, right?
Right.
I mean, it's
Was that a trick question?
Yeah, it's what's right and what's wrong. But I can tell you what's wrong is when people walk away feeling like the song does no longer feels like what they imagined it would feel like.
Yeah.
And look, you and I are going to get to make records, over and over again with all kinds of different people. We owe it to the people that come into our studios and to work with us to make a record that they can be proud of, that they can live with, that they can feel represents what they wanted to come away with. Not what we think is great, but what they think is great. Because I'm going to get to do this over and over, but the people I work with, if they're lucky, they'll make 2 or 3 records in their whole lifetime. And so the important thing is to make the record that they want to make and to help steer it in the best way you can for the best outcome for them. But a lot of times, and if that means taking it all apart, and completely unwinding it and saying, let's start, then so be it. But I think a lot of times that is done for our benefit rather than theirs.
Yeah. I think about hiring a painter recently for my house, and it's like there are things that they did really, really well. And when they suggested we might want to paint the house a certain way here or there, and then I see it, I'm like, oh, that looks killer. Great. I love it. That's different than them trying to make me want to paint it a certain color that I'm just not feeling, Yeah. Like I got to pick the right color. So I think that's great advice, man. I know it's an odd analogy, but it's part of that, that concept of us being in a service industry and capacity to serve the bands.
We're vectors for their creativity.
Yeah,
that's
nice.
What it's supposed to be. That's our job. It's not, our job isn't to be, unless you see yourself as some sort of genius songwriter who is collaborating with the artist. That's a different sort of skill set and some people do that and they do it amazingly well. And and they get incredible results. But I think in general, audio engineering is, we're a conduit, to an end that we need to respect. And I think that's something that, and when you start tearing stuff apart and you start doing it a little bit at a time, you rob that, a lot of, like I said, I don't know how else to say it. It's really just quite simply, I see it a lot of times as benefiting us more than them, because then we get to have control over every little aspect of what we've recorded. And then maybe we can make it sound, competitive in a way that that we think it should be competitive. But really our responsibility is to capture their performance and then make it competitive.
Nice. This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you are ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I mastered my own record, Skadoosh, using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. These techniques would work for you in whichever DAW you are using right now. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads to mix in your own studio, and even include in your mixing portfolio if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Well, cool. Well, one of the common threads across all these genres that we talked about are guitars. Electric guitars, electric guitars, electric guitars. Can we dig in and talk about recording guitars for a moment?
Sure.
What do you feel are some of the common mistakes that people make when recording guitars, whether it's a punk record, a metal record, post-punk? Maybe talk about metal for a moment, because that certainly is one where there's a lot of attention put on the details of it. Punk may have been, well, just talk about them all. What's the difference between guitar and getting the guitars right in all three of those genres?
I mean, well, punk records are just, you set up a mic in front of the guitar and in front of the amp, in placing the mic where you think it'll represent best what is coming out of that amp, and then that's the end of it. I mean, after that, you don't see Greg Ginn coming in and doubling his guitar and then changing guitars and tripling it with a different guitar and then playing it in another octave and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't happen. So, just capturing, something honestly in punk has always been, the most important part of it. In metal, it's just creating, the most, especially, even in the grunge era and the metal era, it's all been about just doing whatever you have to do to make the guitars sound gigantic. And, there are as many techniques for doing that as there are engineers, but my favorite tool is to run Jonathan Little's Little Lab box into like a couple, 3 or 4 different heads and combo amps and have the guitar player play them and get a mixture between something that has some punch in it, something that has a lot of saturation, and something that has a lot of tonefulness to it, and combine those to something that you can capture in a single performance, and then change guitars and double it up. That's what I like to do.
Nice. We were just talking about that recently with John Paterno, the PCP, the Little Labs PCP, which I have here too.
Yeah, I love that thing.
Lets you, route out to 3 amps. I think you can daisy chain the PCP too if you want to send it to 6 amps or whatever you want.
Yeah, you can. Right? Yeah, Jonathan Little is a wonderful human being and a brilliant tech, and that's a really great box. I mean, if you want to run more than 1 amp, you got to have one of those boxes. I mean, it's an off the shelf essential tool for recording guitars. You know?
That's great. That's great. Yeah, Rockstars, I encourage you to check out Little Labs. Some of the other tools I know that are very useful that come from there are the IBP phase alignment tool. So you can sort of phase align your direct bass channel with your amp. I guess you could use the IBP to just kind of phase align 2 guitar amps too, if you want.
Oh, you can also phase align 2 amps, 2 microphones on a single amp, right? Which is one of the, I think that the rule is, as it was explained to me, was that the microphones have to be twice as far apart from each other as they are from the source.
Right.
So when you put if you want to put 2 microphones pointing at exactly the same part of the speaker, that's hard to do. Follow that rule. So Jonathan's little in-between phase thing helps delay and separate the polar patterns of those microphones so that you can pretend like they were placed properly. And it's really stunning how different it sounds as you roll across his that pot that changes the phase by degrees.
That's cool. That's cool. And also, I wrote down a great quote from you. Basically, there are as many different techniques for recording as there are engineers. I modified it slightly how you said it, but that's a great quote. All right, so we've got a guitar splitting out to lots of amps for the kind of metal approach, and being able to have a variety of tones to work with. Anything coming from the post-punk era that's helpful, or is that sort of more of the same things we've just described?
Well, I think that there in the 80s and to some degree in the 90s, there was this. I think a lot of it in the 80s, there was this idea that drums need to be recorded and represented as discrete little sounds. There's a tom-tom, and then there's another tom, and there's a kick drum, and then and I think it was sort of a holdover from the disco era and the drum machine era, and I think that one of the things that I decided, in the early 90s or something, was that a drum set is in a single instrument, and that every part of it that interferes with every other part of it is part of the beauty and sound of that instrument. And that, it's important to capture that just like you capture the band. Mm-hmm. You can't, putting gates on things and all that stuff. I think it just robs the drums of the energy and overtone series and the whole beauty of the instrument, which is one of the great parts of rock music is the drummer and how much energy and how much difference that can make in a record. Huge.
Well, so do you have any tricks for us? If we're going to talk about drums, any techniques or tricks that help us capture that drum set as a whole instead of being just individuals?
Oh, absolutely. Here's my recommendation. And if you've never done it, you've got to do it at least once, just so you can hear it, is use a couple of Coles 4038s overhead of the drums. Those microphones are magic, and they're dark, and they're not, what most people would go, oh yeah, I want to capture the top set of the drum, but they capture the whole drum set. I mean, you could just record the entire drum set with just those overheads, and it would sound great.
Yeah.
And the other thing about them is that they take EQ and a cut and boosting of different frequencies. Those ribbon mics are so awesome that you can do almost anything to them and they'll sound wonderful. And
except blow on them.
Yeah, don't blow on them and don't keep turning the phantom power off and on while they're plugged in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What about mic preamps? Have you found any preamps to be preferable to others as far as whatever that means?
The greatest mic preamp that was ever built, in my opinion, was built by Dean Jensen right before he passed away. It was called a Boulder. And you don't see them very much because they didn't build very many of them, but the Boulder mic preamps are, if you ever see one for sale anywhere, buy it immediately. And you'll never look back. John Hardy tried to replicate it in the twin servo version of his Jensen, which he actually got permission to use the circuit that Dean Jensen developed for his mic pre. After Dean passed away, John Hardy got permission to use that twin servo because it was a proprietary way of building that mic pre. But Dean's version of the mic pre is, it was a hand-built thing that has a giant trioidal transformer in it. I mean, each one of them weighs like 20 pounds. And they are, they don't have the personality of a 1073 but they are so linear and so immediate, that I've had a lot of engineers come in here and use those mic pre's and tell me that they never heard a drum set sound like that before they plugged them into those mic pre's.
Now, are these the ones that you retrofitted into your console, or are these outboard mic pre's?
No, these are outboard mic pre's that Dean built as a product in partnership with a company out of Denver called Boulder. Boulder later on went on to be some ultra high-end hi-fi company that builds, home theater system for people who have, $80,000 to spend on a CD player.
Right.
But the mic pre's that they built with Dean are just absolutely stunning and still amazing. And Jensen transformers that still operate out of Chatsworth continue to support them. If anything happens to one of them, you take them there. They honor Dean's legacy and memory by making sure that these things work and they can fix them and they can recap them and they can, it's so seriously that if you put me on a desert island with a couple of Coles, a couple of Jensen mic pre's, and maybe an Avalon, 2044, I'd be okay.
You might need some power.
Yeah, I might need. Yeah, well, that's true. Power is important.
Okay, cool, man. Well, this has been a wonderful interview. Let's jump to the ending here, and we'll ask a couple of our outro questions. And again, thank you for joining us here, Wyn. This is great hearing all these stories. It's like I feel like I'm going back in time and living some of these different eras on Redondo Beach, and it's pretty cool. Now I want to go watch Below, the movie with Johnny Depp, one more time and see all that again. But when you started back in recording, what do you feel like was holding you back?
I didn't know anything about recording. I don't have a degree in electrical engineering. And what I needed when I came into the studio was somebody who had the technical background to help me understand what I was supposed to be doing. And Peter, the guy that I mentioned earlier, Peter Butt, he was a great teacher and he wasn't the most patient person in the world, but it didn't keep me from asking the same questions over and over and over. He taught me the importance of how to bias and align a tape recorder and why it was important and how to troubleshoot electronics without, jumping to conclusions, how to approach solving technical issues in ways that actually made sense. And, so that's what sort of held me back in the beginning. And once I started to get a footing there and I felt like I actually knew how all these pieces connected together, that helped a lot. That was an important step.
Now, how about some of the best advice you remember receiving?
The best advice was, very early advice from Ken when I was trying to make a record. And I said, what would you say the most important thing is? He said, well, it's most important is that it's in time and that it's in tune. Those two things right there can make your record sound, can make anything you're working on sound way, way better than it otherwise would. And I think it sounds obvious, but it is the truth. If you can take something that's really, really great, and if it's all over the map groove wise and the tuning is all messed up, it's almost impossible to make it relatable to anybody. But on the other side, if you take a marginal song and it's sort of grooving and it has and it's in tune,
and keep your
people
attention.
can listen. Yeah, people can listen to it.
I guess that could be the reason sometimes to begin breaking down your recording into one thing at a time. If it's not in time and it's not in tune, and that's the next step to try and get it there.
That's true, and that is, it's funny because we're talking about Ken. Ken was much more a very piece at a time sort of engineer, and he was very much a guy who would pull all the bits apart and put them back together in ways that amazed me all the time and amazed the people that he worked with. But I could never replicate that. The only time I ever get close is when I let people play together. And that's an important thing to let people know before you start working, is that, hey, make sure you take some time to make sure your instruments are ready and that you're prepared and that you have you play to a click a little bit. You can get a sense of how this should be put together, and you're going to have a way better chance of coming out with something that you love and that people will be able to listen to.
Yeah, it's like get it in time and get it in tune before you hit the studio.
Yeah, do that part of the homework. Just do that much, and we'll take care of the rest for you.
Now, how about sharing a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something the rock stars can use on their next session?
I already gave that to you, man. That would be the Coles, the 43rd Kicks.
I already gave it to you, and I'm giving it to you again because there's a reason you're supposed to use that one. Those overhead mics. There's this other little box that that if you've never used one, you should play around with someday. It's called it's made by, and I don't know if they're still making them, but it's made by this company out of Scotland called CLM. And it's this dynamic equalizer called an expounder. I like the name.
And it actually does some amazing things. And if you ever get a chance to sit down with one, or you find one in a pawn shop or in an auction, grab it, because they are really something. They have ways of it's an analog version of these frequency-based EQs that actually expand the bands that you select.
That's cool. Yeah. I've only just started experimenting with dynamic EQs, and there's it gets deep.
Yeah, the digital ones get deep. They're easier to use because they're usually represented by some sort of visual interface, so that makes them a little bit easier to use. But I haven't really found too many that sound as good as the analog versions. It's funny, the analog gear is still replicated. I would say that. Here's another tip: find three or four or five pieces of analog gear that you love, and hang on to them because they'll always be great. I mean, my workflow includes a hybrid mixing environment where I work on analog and in the box stuff and have a bunch of hardware inserts. And I have three 1176s now. Universal Audio makes a really nice model of the 1176. Mm-hmm. It doesn't sound like any of the ones that I own, and the three that I own don't sound anything like each other. Mm-hmm. So, there you go. I don't know which 1176 they modeled. They found one that they liked the way it sounded, but the thing about analog gear is it's continuously magical and variable, and it's one of the reasons why the records made during the time period that you mentioned in my bio all sound completely different from one another. No records made during that time sound the same. They all have completely different sonic fingerprints all over them. And when you listen to them one after the other, whether you're listening to Hendrix or the Beatles or the Who or the Stones or anybody, none of those records sound the same. You can't say that today. That's
a good point.
Yeah.
All right, cool, man. Well, speaking of which, any other favorite hardware tools you want to mention?
Hardware tools.
Anything that you're always glad you got it when you make a record? Something physical?
Yeah. Well, the boulders and the 4038s. Those are like my favorite things. I also I love a couple Langs. If you have a couple of those laying around.
The mic pre's?
No, the Lang EQs.
Oh, the Lang EQs. Cool.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about favorite software tools? Anything that you've found really useful or you're just excited about now?
I just found this plugin. Just funny you should mention that. I just found this plugin recently made by Tube, that is a TubeTech plugin modeled by SoftTube, which is their Pultec, the TubeTech's Pultec EQ. I can't remember what the model number of it is, but it's something that's, I think it's actually been out for a while, but I used it the other day and I thought, man, this thing has one of the few digital EQs that feel really like it has some personality, some softness to it, some sort of sonic silkiness that I really dug.
Is it the TubeTech CL1 or CL2?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. CL1, I think.
Nice.
Yeah, and the one that SoftTube makes. And the other thing that is indispensable in my view is George Massenburg's EQ, mm-hmm. digital EQ inside of any workstation. I mean, it is the quintessential problem solver EQ. If you have anything that is bothering you, you can fix it with that.
That reminds me, I need to get one of those. Thanks for bringing it up again.
They are amazingly useful in that world. Yeah.
That's cool. All right. Well, let's jump to the final question here. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine and you're going to go back in time and you're going to find young Wyn and say, stop riding your skateboard for a minute. I want to tell you this bit of advice. Here's the single most important thing you need to know to be a rock star of the recording studio yourself one day. What advice would you go back and give yourself if you could?
Buy the building that you're renting. Yeah. honestly, I mean, that would be one. The other one, I guess, would be be patient with yourself and understand that you're going to get better. It's like anything else. If you put in the time and you put it in honestly, you're going to get a return. And the return is you're going to get better at it. You just got to give yourself a break. I mean, I think a lot of people, there's a lot of pressure on people when they come in to record something. And, you know, when it's your responsibility to capture it, you feel there's a huge responsibility sitting there. And it can cause you to experience a lot of anxiety and stress, where I think if I could do anything for myself back then, it would have been to, and anything I could for anybody else who's just starting out, would be to just, you know, if you're really committed to doing this, just give yourself a break and just realize that, you know, the only way to get better is to make some mistakes. That's, you know, and to have somebody, you know, disappointed from time to time. You'll learn from all of those things and all those experiences, and try and understand that that's part of it. Is part of getting better is making some mistakes.
And I'm going to reiterate your own advice, which is, you know, make a real effort to try and make the record that the artist and the band you're working with wants to make, because you're going to get to make a lot of these just by doing it over and over.
Exactly. That's an important thing. Super important to me.
Cool. Well, Wyn, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars. It's just a blast to hear all these stories and get to hang out with you for a couple hours here. How can the Rockstars find you guys online, follow you? What if they want to come make their next record on the beach? Where should they go?
You can go to tarecording.com, and you can find us on Facebook. It's facebook.total.access.recording. We're there, and reach out to us. And I'm on Facebook, Wyn Davis. Look me up. I try and answer, you know, any questions and respond to anybody who wants to reach out. So thanks for the opportunity to share some of this stuff. And I appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Steve. And we appreciate you being here. Oh, excuse me. I just said Steve because I meant to thank Steve again as well.
Yeah.
So thank you, Wyn, and thank you also to Steve for making the introduction. And hope to see you guys in person soon, and come see the studio and visit.
Come. You know, definitely. I was going to say, you get out here, you come see us for sure.
All right.
And you don't even call, just show up.
I love it, man. Awesome. Well, thanks, man. We'll talk to you soon. Cheers.
Okay, thank you.
All right, cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. Also, remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with these weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free mixing course at mixmasterbundle.com. Look for the link in the show notes. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio, all totally free. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.